With the whirlwind of change Donald Trump has wrought since coming to office 2 months ago, whether on tariffs, Israel-Gaza, immigration, and now, of course, Russia and Ukraine, you'd be forgiven, perhaps, for forgetting one of the biggest orders he's made yet. On the very day he took office, the US president took steps to dismantle the US Agency for International Development and put almost all international aid spending on pause for a 90-day review. Those on the front line of aid work say they've seen their work either frozen or scrapped. Places of hardship and hunger have had lifelines withdrawn. And crucially, the network which gives the world early warnings of famine is currently sitting idle. Aid agencies say the uncertainty that has brought risks the future devastation of vulnerable lives. Well, one expert who is watching this closely is Chris Newton, who's a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group and monitors famine and conflict around the globe. Chris Newton, thanks very much indeed for joining us to talk about this. I mean, it is easy to forget that this was one of those huge moves that Donald Trump took when he came to office. It has been subject to a lot of legal challenge, hasn't it? Where are we at with it at the moment?
Thanks for having me on, and certainly there's been quite a lot of activity. In terms of USAID, it is effectively dismantled from down to just a few hundred staff, and most of its programs officially terminated. Overall, I think there's still quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of what U.S. foreign aid is going to look like going forward, and what role the U.S. is looking to play in the world in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up so many questions about Donald Trump's new vision for America on the global stage, fundamentally, doesn't it? But it is also speaking very directly to a lot of those who would question where foreign aid dollars go. We know that there's been a cut in foreign aid here in the UK, for example. Has he changed the narrative completely on this in America, do you think?
There's certainly a lot of question for the American public about how much of the U.S. federal budget goes to foreign aid. It often polls around, the average American thinks it's maybe 30% or some very large proportion of the federal budget when it was really under 1%. And that really speaks to an impression that maybe not so much the numbers, but that it was, whatever it was too large. And some of this work, at least in terms of taxpayer funds, had started to become quite unpopular. And that's ultimately what the administration is speaking to and trying to work with.
So it should be fairly obvious what the biggest dangers are of this move by the new administration. What are the biggest worries that you have?
Defunding so much so quickly of the global humanitarian system, not only the parts of it that work on famine directly, is going to make and is already making famine more likely to occur. But also when it does occur, it's likely to make these famines larger than we've seen in several decades. Going back to the 90s or earlier periods where we see not the thousands or tens of thousands that have died in some of the smaller famines of the last 20 years, but more like the great famines of the past, as some call them, where death tolls are in the hundreds of thousands. And at the same time, our ability to see these famines is massively diminished, and it will be much easier to hide some of these famines, especially when they're deliberately caused, particularly as a weapon of war.
And it's that ability to foresee crises that could be most fundamentally hit with this move. Just talk us through that a bit and the real dangers of dismantling potentially an early warning system of famine.
Sure. So there were two main efforts or systems that the world had to warn about and identify famine. One was a U.S. government project that had been running for just about 40 years, the Famine Early Warning Systems Network. And the other is a UN-led effort commonly goes by the acronym IPC, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. And these systems worked in tandem, where different parts of them would collect enormous amounts of data on things like what people are eating and how much, how many days people have been going hungry, levels of acute malnutrition in children, and maybe most importantly, mortality. And so these cuts have taken FuseNet offline. The US also gave some funding to that other system, the UN-led effort, IPC. And so it also takes a funding hit. But more importantly, the broader defunding of the humanitarian sector is going to take away, already is taking away, a lot of the expertise, the data collection, and all of the other inputs that go into making these systems work. And so as we have an active and likely expanding famine in Sudan, we have a heightened risk of famine in Gaza with the collapse of the ceasefire there, and rising risk in a large and growing number of countries around the world, we have greatly reduced our ability to warn about and identify famine.
And I mean, you allude to it just in those last couple of comments there, the absolute connection between famine and conflict, and famine and the potential for political upheaval and unrest is deeply strong, isn't it?
Yes, there are many consequences to famine. It's one of the really the main reason that the US became a leader in preventing and responding to famine since World War One, is that there was a strong bipartisan, enduring consensus that the consequences of famine are bad for the United States, and a number of other actors agreed with that. Um, I mean, the famines have, much like civil and other wars, a cascading set of political and social consequences that are incredibly hard to predict once they begin. You don't really know what you're unleashing once a famine, especially a large and intense one, hits a country or a region. We've seen famines or even just severe food price crises not rising to the level of famine topple regimes, trigger revolutions, whether this was Haiti during the global food price crisis of 2007, 2008, the role that food prices played in the Sudanese revolution. In 1974 alone, multiple governments around the world, from Afghanistan to Bangladesh, saw famines topple governments, with a long series of political consequences following.
There have been times in the past when the US government has been very aware of the fact that you can use food as leverage, and you can use food and the threat of starvation as a weapon of war.
Yes, that's a major reason that we've seen famine resurgent really since 2011, starting with a famine in Somalia, is that exact reason. The overwhelming driver of famine risk and occurrence in the world today is conflict. And more often, it's not just that there is a conflict happening and that this is incidental to that conflict, but that starvation and famine are being used as weapons of war, and that famine is being deliberately created in pursuit of war aims. There are times in recently and in previous decades where the U.S. played a role in arresting that descent into famine or responding to famine, but there are absolutely times where the U.S. played a major role in creating famine or withholding assistance as famine unfolded because it prioritized other objectives. We've seen that from several different points in the Cold War to U.S. counterterror policy and the role it played in the failed response to excellent early warning for Somalia's 2011 famine. And we've certainly seen that more recently in U.S. policy on Gaza as the risk of famine rose sharply, and then famine may have occurred. It's still unclear given the lack of data collection that's been possible.
Yeah, and you alluded earlier too, Chris, to the current situation in Sudan, on which we're reporting today. That is one of the key areas where those who are on the ground trying to support aid agencies will be most concerned with this move by the US government.
Absolutely. The funding cuts, the dismantling of USAID, that was most immediately felt in frontline famine response and prevention efforts in Sudan, particularly networks of kitchens in places like Khartoum, the capital, but also some of the last reports for Sudan from these systems where that famine had not only begun in Sudan but was rapidly expanding. in more and more areas across the country, and that there was a risk of famine in additional areas. And as this was happening, the lights were turned out for one of these two global early warning systems, and the Sudanese government, or at least the Sudanese armed forces led government out of Port Sudan, withdrew itself from the UN-led process, which again shows why there was such a need to have these two different complementary systems.
And finally, I suppose there'll be some who'll be listening and watching, Chris, who'll say, I'm living in an economy, and it may be in a developed Western world, where in the streets in the town where I live, money is so tight. We are living with great hardship and great poverty. And it is my government's responsibility to fund the place where I live first before thinking about foreign aid. And that is something that people feel very deeply in very many places. What would you say to them? Because they may well be very understanding of what the president is trying to do.
Certainly. I think one, it's about telling a story about how much can be accomplished with very small amounts of foreign aid, that foreign aid can have significant immediate domestic benefits without disrupting food prices, and that there are real long-term objectives too that this feeds into. Certainly, in an understanding way, we all have concerns about the price of groceries and everyday necessities wherever we live.
Chris Newton, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.